The water splashed across his shirt, cold and deliberate. She didn't apologize, just laughed. "Watch where you're going," she sneered. To her, he was invisible. Just a cleaner. Just another face in the background. He quietly picked up his bucket and walked away. She watched him go, still amused. Around her, others chuckled too. No one questioned it. No one cared. But down the hall, a meeting was about to start. A room filled with suits, tension, and deals worth millions. And the man she mocked? He was heading straight there. Doors opened. The same man stepped inside, calm and composed. Suddenly, everyone stood. Phones went down. Chairs scraped back. The laughter from earlier vanished into silence. He walked past the long table and sat at its head. The woman's face turned pale. Her smirk disappeared. Because the man she soaked in arrogance wasn't a cleaner, he was the CEO. And in that moment, her cruelty cost her more than dignity. It cost her a future. Welcome to Heroes Unheard. Before we continue this emotional story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being a part of it. The Sterling Financial Building rose 43 floors above the downtown district, its glass facade reflecting the ambitions of everyone who worked within its walls. From the outside, it looked like a monument to success, the kind of corporate headquarters that appeared in magazines as a symbol of American business achievement. Inside, the reality was more complex, a carefully orchestrated hierarchy where your floor assignment told everyone exactly how much power you wielded and how much respect you deserved. The 38th floor housed the executive offices, where decisions affecting thousands of employees and millions of dollars were made daily. The marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and every piece of furniture had been selected by interior designers who charged more for a consultation than most people earned in a month. This was where Vivian Sterling spent her days, not because she had earned a place there through merit or achievement, but because she had married into a family whose name was painted in gold letters on the building's directory. Vivian had grown up in modest circumstances, the daughter of a small-town pharmacist who had struggled to pay for her college education. But she had learned early that beauty and ambition could open doors that talent alone might leave closed. Her marriage to Charles Sterling III had been calculated rather than romantic, a strategic alliance that had given her access to wealth and status in exchange for the kind of companionship that looked good at charity galas and corporate events. 20 years later, she had perfected the art of being Mrs. Sterling. She knew which restaurants impressed potential business partners, which charities attracted the right kind of attention, and which social circles offered the most advantageous connections. But more than anything, she had learned to wield the power that came with her position like a weapon, using it to establish and maintain her place in a world where status was everything. Her office on the 38th floor overlooked the city she had conquered through marriage, its windows offering a view that reminded her daily of how far she had risen from her humble beginnings. The people who worked in the building below her seemed as small and insignificant as ants from her perspective, their individual struggles and triumphs invisible from the height of her privilege. What Vivian didn't know was that the building's actual owner rarely visited his own property. Charles Sterling III preferred to manage his business empire from a distance, making decisions through phone calls and video conferences from his various residences around the world. The day-to-day operations were handled by a board of directors who reported to him quarterly, leaving Vivian to play the role of lady of the manor in a castle whose true king was perpetually absent. This arrangement suited her perfectly. It allowed her to enjoy all the perquisites of wealth and power without the inconvenience of actual responsibility. She could hold meetings that accomplished nothing, make pronouncements that affected no one important, and generally conduct herself as if the entire building existed for her personal gratification. The staff had learned to navigate her moods and demands with the practiced efficiency of people whose livelihoods depended on keeping her satisfied. There was Margaret, her personal assistant, who had mastered the art of nodding seriously at instructions that made no sense. There was David, the building's security chief, who understood that his primary job was making Mrs. Sterling feel important rather than keeping the building secure. And there were dozens of others whose daily routines were shaped by her whims and expectations. But there was one person in the building who had managed to remain largely invisible to Vivian's attention. someone who moved through the halls so quietly and efficiently that she barely registered his presence. He wore the simple uniform of the cleaning staff, carried supplies that marked him as part of the invisible army of workers who maintained the building's pristine appearance, and conducted himself with the kind of professional discretion that made him functionally invisible to people who saw only uniforms rather than individuals. His name was Marcus, though few people in the building knew it. He had been working there for 6 months, arriving early in the morning and staying late in the evening, moving through offices and conference rooms with methodical precision. To most of the executive staff, he was simply part of the infrastructure, as unremarkable and necessary as the air conditioning or the elevator system. What they didn't know was that Marcus was conducting the most comprehensive audit in the company's history, documenting every aspect of the business from the ground level up. He had access to offices when they were empty, could observe conversations that people thought were private, and had assembled a picture of the company's operations that would have shocked the board of directors if they had known it existed. The morning that would change everything started like any other, with Vivian arriving at her office in a mood that had been soured by traffic delays and a breakfast meeting that had failed to produce the social connections she had been hoping for. She swept through the building's lobby with the imperious stride of someone who had never doubted her right to be there, barely acknowledging the security guards and maintenance staff who stepped aside to let her pass. The elevator to the 38th floor was supposed to be exclusively for executive use, a privilege that Vivian guarded jealously. She had made it clear to building management that she didn't want to share the space with what she called the support staff, preferring to maintain the illusion that people like her didn't need to interact with people who actually worked for a living. But on this particular morning, as the elevator doors opened on the 15th floor, Marcus stepped inside carrying a cart of cleaning supplies and a large bottle of water that needed to be delivered to one of the conference rooms. He moved with the quiet efficiency that had made him nearly invisible throughout the building, positioning himself in the corner and waiting silently for the elevator to reach his destination. Vivian's reaction was immediate and disproportionate. "Excuse me," she said with the kind of icy politeness that was more cutting than outright rudeness. "I think you're on the wrong elevator." Marcus looked up from the supply cart he had been organizing. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I have a delivery for the 36th floor." "The service elevator is at the other end of the building," Vivian replied, her voice carrying the automatic authority of someone who had never been questioned. "This elevator is for executives only." It was a lie, of course. There was no official policy restricting elevator use, just Vivian's personal preference for maintaining distance from people she considered beneath her notice. But Marcus had learned to pick his battles carefully, understanding that confrontation with building executives usually ended badly for people in uniforms. "Of course," he said politely, reaching for the button to return to the lobby. But Vivian wasn't finished. The morning's frustrations had been building inside her like pressure in a closed system, and Marcus had the misfortune of being available when she needed someone to absorb her irritation. "In the future, please be more mindful of appropriate boundaries," she said, her voice growing sharper. "There are protocols in this building, and everyone is expected to follow them regardless of their position." Marcus nodded silently, but his composure seemed to irritate her further. She was accustomed to seeing people become flustered when she asserted her authority, to watching them scramble to apologize and make amends. His calm acceptance of her criticism felt like a form of resistance that she couldn't tolerate. As the elevator reached the 36th floor and Marcus prepared to leave, Vivian made a decision that would haunt her for months to come. She reached for the water bottle on his cart, ostensibly to move it out of her way, but her grip was careless and her movement was deliberately clumsy. The bottle slipped from her hands and crashed against the elevator floor, sending water cascading across the marble surface and soaking into Marcus's uniform. The liquid spread quickly, darkening his shirt and dripping from his sleeves as he stood perfectly still, making no attempt to avoid the deluge. "Oh," Vivian said with mock concern, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "How clumsy of me. I hope that doesn't stain." She made no move to help clean up the mess she had created, instead stepping carefully around the spreading water as if it were something distasteful that she couldn't be expected to touch. Other people in similar situations might have been embarrassed by their clumsiness, might have apologized genuinely, and offered to help with the cleanup. But Vivian's behavior made it clear that the incident had been intentional, a deliberate act of humiliation designed to remind Marcus of his place in her world. Marcus looked down at his soaked uniform, then back at Vivian's face, which showed no trace of genuine remorse. Water continued to drip from his clothes onto the elevator floor, creating a growing puddle that would need to be cleaned before someone slipped and fell. "Accidents happen," he said quietly, his voice carrying no anger or resentment, just the weary acceptance of someone who had learned to endure indignities with grace. But his composure only seemed to fuel Vivian's desire to provoke a reaction. She wanted to see him become flustered, wanted to watch him scramble to apologize for her behavior, wanted confirmation that her power over him was absolute and unquestionable. "They certainly do," she agreed with a smile that had no warmth in it. "Especially when people don't pay attention to where they belong. Perhaps this will help you remember to use the appropriate elevator in the future." The elevator doors opened on the 36th floor, and Marcus stepped out into the hallway with water still dripping from his clothes. Behind him, Vivian remained in the elevator, watching his retreating figure with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully asserted her dominance over someone she perceived as powerless. "You might want to change into something dry," she called after him with false helpfulness. "We can't have the cleaning staff looking unprofessional." Marcus paused for a moment in the hallway, his back still turned to her, his shoulders straight despite the humiliation he had just endured. Then he continued walking toward the stairwell, disappearing from view as the elevator doors closed, and carried Vivian up to her domain on the 38th floor. She spent the rest of the morning in meetings that accomplished nothing, reviewing reports that contained no surprises, and making decisions that would be forgotten by the end of the week. The incident with Marcus had already faded from her mind, filed away as just another moment when she had successfully reminded someone of their proper place in the hierarchy. But Marcus hadn't forgotten. As he changed into a spare uniform he kept in his locker, he thought about the woman who had deliberately humiliated him for the crime of existing in her space. He thought about the casual cruelty that came so naturally to people who had never learned to see service workers as fully human. And he thought about the phone call he would need to make later that afternoon, the conversation that would set in motion events that Vivian Sterling could never have anticipated. The building continued to operate with its usual efficiency throughout the morning. Meetings were held, deals were negotiated, and decisions were made that affected the lives of people who would never see the inside of the executive floors. But beneath the surface of normal business operations, something had shifted. A line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed, and the consequences were already beginning to ripple outward in ways that no one could predict. At exactly 2 o'clock that afternoon, an emergency board meeting was called. The message went out to all department heads and senior executives, requesting their immediate presence in the main conference room on the 40th floor. The tone was urgent but vague, leaving everyone to speculate about what kind of crisis could have prompted such short notice. Vivian received the message with a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. Emergency meetings disrupted her carefully planned schedule, and she resented being summoned like a common employee rather than consulted as the important executive she believed herself to be. But she couldn't ignore a board-level directive, so she gathered her materials and made her way to the conference room with the reluctant compliance of someone who had better things to do. The 40th floor was even more impressive than the executive levels below it, designed to intimidate visitors and remind everyone of the serious nature of the business conducted there. The main conference room featured a table that could seat 30 people, surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than most cars. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city, while oil paintings of the company's founders gazed down from the walls with expressions of stern authority. As Vivian entered the room, she noticed that most of the seats were already filled with department heads and senior staff she recognized. But there was an unusual tension in the air, a sense that something significant was about to happen that went beyond the routine business of corporate governance. At the head of the table, the company's chief operating officer was shuffling through papers with the nervous energy of someone who had been given a task he didn't fully understand. Board members were checking their phones and whispering to each other in the kind of hushed tones that suggested important information was being shared among the inner circle. "Does anyone know what this is about?" Vivian asked Margaret, her assistant, who had followed her into the room. "No one's saying anything official," Margaret replied quietly. "But I heard it came directly from the owner. Apparently, He's finally coming in to address some concerns that have been brought to his attention. Vivian felt a flicker of unease. Charles Sterling III almost never visited the building that bore his name, preferring to manage his business empire from the comfort of his various residences around the world. If he was making a personal appearance, it suggested that something had gone seriously wrong, something that required his direct intervention. The room fell silent as the doors opened, and a small group of people entered with the purposeful stride of those who commanded absolute authority. At the front was a man Vivian recognized from newspaper photographs and business magazines, though she had never seen him in person. Charles Sterling III was shorter than she had expected, with the kind of quiet intensity that made him seem larger than his physical presence suggested. But what caught Vivian's attention wasn't the owner of the building. It was the man walking beside him, wearing an expensive suit that fit him perfectly, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who belonged in rooms like this. It took her a moment to recognize him without the cleaning uniform, but when she did, the blood drained from her face so quickly that Margaret asked if she was feeling unwell. It was Marcus. The cleaner she had humiliated in the elevator that morning was walking into the boardroom alongside the owner of the company, being treated with the deference usually reserved for the most important executives. Charles Sterling III took his seat at the head of the conference table with the matter-of-fact authority of someone who owned everything in sight. Around him, 30 of the company's most senior executives and department heads waited in silence, understanding that whatever had prompted this unprecedented meeting was serious enough to require the owner's personal attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles began, his voice carrying easily through the large conference room, "I want to thank you all for gathering on such short notice. I know many of you are wondering why I've decided to make this rare appearance in my own building." He gestured toward Marcus, who had taken a seat to his right in a position usually reserved for the most trusted advisors. "I'd like you to meet Marcus Thompson, my nephew and the person I've been grooming to eventually take over this company." For the past 6 months, Marcus has been conducting what we call a ground-level assessment, working throughout this building in various capacities to understand how our company actually operates versus how we think it operates. The silence in the room was so complete that the only sound was the whisper of air conditioning through the vents. Vivian felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her chair, leaving her suspended over an abyss of her own making. Around the table, other executives were beginning to process the implications of what they had just heard. Marcus Thompson wasn't just any cleaner. He was the heir apparent to a business empire worth billions of dollars, someone who had been observing their behavior while they had treated him as invisible, someone who had access to information and decision-making power that none of them had imagined. "Marcus has been documenting everything," Charles continued, his tone remaining conversational despite the devastating nature of his words. "Employee treatment, operational efficiency, workplace culture, management effectiveness. He's assembled a comprehensive picture of how this company functions when senior leadership thinks no one important is watching." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his hands folded on the table in front of him. When he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet authority as his uncle's, but with an edge that hadn't been there during his months in uniform. "What I've discovered," Marcus said, "is that this company has two very different faces. There's the professional, respectful environment that exists when everyone knows they're being observed by their superiors. And there's the reality that emerges when people think they're interacting with those they perceive as beneath their notice." He looked around the table, making eye contact with several executives who were beginning to understand that their careers might be hanging in the balance. "I've witnessed harassment, discrimination, and casual cruelty that would shock you if you believed it was happening in your departments. I've seen employees treated as subhuman by managers who wouldn't dream of behaving that way in front of their own supervisors." Vivian's hands were trembling now, and she gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to find some way to minimize what had happened in the elevator that morning. But her throat felt constricted, and the words wouldn't come. Charles Sterling's eyes moved around the table with the calculating precision of someone taking inventory. "We're going to address each incident individually," he said, "starting with the most egregious examples of behavior that reflects poorly on this company's values and my family's reputation." Marcus opened a leather portfolio and pulled out a stack of photographs. The first one he placed on the table showed the interior of an elevator, water pooled on the marble floor, and the unmistakable evidence of the accident that had soaked his uniform. This morning at approximately 9:15, Marcus said, his voice steady and professional, I was deliberately humiliated by someone who thought my position as a cleaner meant I didn't deserve basic human dignity. The photograph was followed by others. Marcus's water-stained uniform, the spreading puddle in the elevator, and most damning of all, a screenshot from the building's security cameras that showed Vivian's face clearly as she dropped the water bottle with obvious intent. The building's elevator system is monitored by security cameras, Charles explained to the room, though his eyes were focused on Vivian. Every conversation, every interaction, every moment of cruelty is documented and stored on servers that my security team reviews regularly. Vivian felt the room spinning around her. Not only had her behavior been witnessed and documented, but it had been observed by the one person in the building whose opinion could destroy her life completely. Mrs. Sterling, Charles said, and his use of her married name carried a weight that made everyone in the room understand exactly how serious this situation had become. I believe you have something to say about this incident. All eyes turned to Vivian, who found herself the center of attention in a way she had never wanted. The same position of prominence she had craved and cultivated for years had become a spotlight illuminating her worst behavior for everyone to see. It was an accident, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for the water to spill. Marcus reached into his portfolio again and pulled out a tablet computer. The screen showed security footage from the elevator, with audio that captured every word of their conversation. Would you like me to play the recording? He asked quietly. So everyone can judge for themselves whether this was an accident. Vivian's face had gone completely white. The recording would reveal not just her deliberate action, but her cruel words afterward, her complete lack of remorse, her obvious pleasure in humiliating someone she thought was powerless. That won't be necessary, Charles said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. I think we all understand what happened here. He leaned back in his chair and looked around the room at the faces staring back at him. Some showed shock, others embarrassment, and a few displayed the calculating expression of people trying to figure out how to distance themselves from someone who had just been exposed as a liability. This company bears my family's name, Charles continued. Every person who works here represents not just themselves, but the values and reputation that my grandfather built over 70 years ago. When employees are treated with cruelty and disrespect, when basic human dignity is trampled on for sport, it reflects on all of us. He stood up from his chair, and automatically everyone else in the room stood as well, understanding that the meeting was about to conclude. Mrs. Sterling, he said, and now his voice carried a finality that made Vivian's knees buckle. Your services are no longer required. Security will escort you from the building, and your personal effects will be sent to you. Your access to all company resources, including your office, your corporate credit cards, and your parking space, has been revoked effective immediately. The words hit Vivian like physical blows. Everything she had built over 20 years, every connection she had cultivated, every privilege she had enjoyed, was disappearing in the space of a single conversation. You can't do this, she said, desperation making her voice shrill. I'm family. I'm Mrs. Sterling. Charles looked at her with an expression that was almost pitying. You're Mrs. Sterling in name only, he said quietly. Charles Sterling III filed for divorce 3 months ago. You've been served papers that you've apparently chosen to ignore, but that doesn't change the legal reality. You have no family connection to this company and no claim to any position or authority here. The room was so silent that Vivian could hear her own heartbeat. Around the table, 30 executives were witnessing the complete destruction of someone who had ruled over them with casual cruelty for years. Marcus stood up and walked around the table to where Vivian was still sitting, her face frozen in shock and disbelief. When he reached her chair, he spoke quietly enough that only she could hear him. You asked me to remember my place, he said. I hope this helps you remember yours. Security arrived within minutes. 2 professional guards who treated Vivian with the same courtesy they would show any departing employee. There was no drama, no scene, just the quiet efficiency of people who had handled similar situations many times before. They escorted her to her office to collect personal items, then walked her through the lobby she had once commanded like a queen. past employees who watched in stunned silence as the woman who had terrorized them for years disappeared through the revolving doors into obscurity. The building felt different in the weeks that followed. Word of what had happened spread quickly through all 43 floors, carried by the kind of informal network that exists in every workplace. The story grew in the telling, but the essential truth remained unchanged. Someone who had abused their power had faced consequences. Someone who had been invisible had been revealed as the most important person in the room. Marcus Thompson officially joined the company's executive team the following month, taking an office on the 40th floor with responsibilities that spanned all aspects of the business. But he maintained a practice that surprised many of his new colleagues. Every week, he spent one full day working alongside employees in different departments, not as an executive observing their work, but as a colleague contributing to their efforts. He cleaned offices with the janitorial staff, answered phones in customer service, and worked assembly lines in the company's manufacturing facilities. It wasn't a publicity stunt or a management technique. It was his way of ensuring that he never lost sight of what the business looked like from the ground level. Never forgot that every employee deserved to be treated with dignity regardless of their position in the corporate hierarchy. The changes he implemented were subtle but profound. Performance reviews began to include evaluations of how managers treated subordinates, not just how they achieved financial targets. Employee satisfaction surveys included questions about workplace respect and dignity, with results that carried real weight in promotion and compensation decisions. Most importantly, a clear reporting structure was established for employees who experienced harassment or discrimination, with the guarantee that complaints would be investigated by people who had the authority to implement meaningful consequences. Charles Sterling III returned to his preferred life of managing the business from a distance, but he maintained regular communication with Marcus about the cultural transformation taking place in the building that bore their family name. The financial performance of the company improved significantly in the months following Vivian's departure, a development that analysts attributed to improved employee morale and retention. But perhaps the most significant change was harder to quantify. The building's elevators were no longer segregated by unwritten rules about who belonged where. The executive dining room was open to employees from all departments during certain hours. Most importantly, the invisible army of custodial staff, security guards, and maintenance workers began to be seen and acknowledged as integral parts of the organization rather than as background fixtures to be ignored. Marcus kept the cleaning uniform he had worn during his 6 months of undercover observation, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. He hung it in his office closet behind the expensive suits he now wore to board meetings and investor presentations, a symbol of the perspective that had shaped his understanding of leadership and responsibility. Sometimes, when he was working late in his corner office on the 40th floor, he would think about Vivian Sterling and wonder what had happened to her after she had been escorted from the building. He had heard rumors that she had left the city, that her divorce settlement had been less generous than she had expected, that the social connections she had cultivated for 20 years had evaporated once she no longer carried the Sterling name. But he felt no satisfaction in her downfall, no pleasure in the reversal of fortune that had elevated him while destroying her. Instead, he felt something closer to sadness for someone who had possessed so much privilege and had chosen to use it as a weapon rather than as a tool for building something better. The lesson he carried forward wasn't about revenge or justice in the dramatic sense, but about the responsibility that comes with power and the importance of remembering that everyone deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. He had learned that true leadership isn't about commanding respect through fear or intimidation, but about earning it through consistent demonstration of character and integrity. The Sterling Financial Building continued to rise 43 floors above the downtown district, its glass facade still reflecting the ambitions of everyone who worked within its walls. But inside, the culture had been transformed by the simple recognition that a person's worth isn't determined by their job title or their place in the organizational chart, but by their humanity and their contribution to the collective effort of building something meaningful. And sometimes, when new employees started work in the building, older staff members would tell them the story of the cleaning man who turned out to be the owner's nephew, and the executive who learned too late that cruelty has consequences. It became a cautionary tale about the importance of treating everyone with respect, not because you never know who they might turn out to be, but because everyone deserves respect simply by virtue of being human. The most powerful lessons often come disguised as ordinary moments, hidden in interactions that seem insignificant until their true meaning is revealed. Marcus's story reminds us that character is revealed not in how we treat those who can help us, but in how we treat those who we think can't hurt us. Because sometimes the person cleaning your office is also the person who will determine your future, and sometimes the greatest power lies not in the ability to humiliate others, but in the wisdom to lift them up. True authority comes not from the capacity to diminish others, but from the commitment to see the dignity in every person we encounter, regardless of their role in our lives or their position in whatever hierarchy we think we understand. This story was brought to you by Heroes Unheard. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.